Now, the Prime Minister, back to this news, we've been telling you about this, has promised £5 million to help local groups fight extremism, he says. It's part of the government's much-anticipated counter-radicalisation strategy, which is expected to be unveiled tomorrow. Well, earlier in the year, David Cameron came under fire for accusing some Muslim communities of quietly condoning extremist ideology. Joining me now to discuss that and the strategy are Ed Husain, an expert on radicalisation and senior advisor to the Centre on Religion and Politics, and Zahed, Amanullah, who's the Senior Programme Manager at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And we'll stay with you, seeing as we landed upon you. And very good afternoon, morning to both of you, gentlemen. What do you think, first of all, about the money being put behind this? We'll get to the ideas in a moment or two, but $5 million isn't a lot.
It's not a lot, but it's important to know that where the message is coming from is as important as what the message is. And when governments take the lead in putting the messaging out there and financing the messaging, it affects the credibility of the message. I mean, we believe that civil society-led approach is the best approach, and the organizations the government wants to support are great organizations. There's no doubt about that. We're all on the same page as far as that goes. But the sense that the government is orchestrating it with financing could very much dampen the message.
What do you think about that then, Ed, as the numbers and the fact the government is behind it?
See, this is part of the problem, Dermot, that if the government does put money behind it, it's damned for putting money behind it. If the government does not put money behind it, as it was for the last 5 years, constantly accused of not doing anything about this problem. So the government is damned if it does, damned if it doesn't. But I agree with you, and I agree with Zahed, that the amount of money being put forward really tiny amounts, only £5 million. I mean, that's not a huge amount. The previous government put £70 million and it still got a lot of flack. So going forward, we ought to realise that the message coming from government, putting money behind it, is the right thing. But Zahed is right, we should have more private sector money going in to the tunes of tens of more millions of money. But we have to be honest about this problem, that it is a religious problem. It is an interpretation of scripture, and no matter what the government does, it should lead, rightly, and it does. We ought to be candid about the problem, that there are two dimensions that perhaps we're not paying full attention to. One is that if this problem is solved in relation to ISIS, there will be another organisation that replaces ISIS, because there is an ideology and a theology feeding behind it. My organisation released a report earlier this month focusing on this. And the second aspect is, this is not homegrown terrorism. There's an international dimension to it. What happens with Assad in Syria and not getting rid of that man has an impact on our communities and our security here. And unless we admit this theological religious dimension to this foreign policy grievance that people have, it's going to be hard throwing breadcrumbs to the tune of 5 million and hoping that the problem goes away. But the government's instincts are right to identify this problem and try to lead on it.
OK, but I mean, there's another aspect to it, isn't there, as Zahed, Amanullah? There's the fact that, and as Ed Husain touched on there, is that well, government attempts have been going on, and better funded ones have been going on for years, and it certainly really moved on after 7/7. That's 10 years ago. If it hasn't worked by now, is it going to work with an extra 5 million?
That's a very good point, and I think Ed's right in saying that there is a religious aspect to this. But again, who the messenger is in addressing the issue is so important. And governments certainly do have a role to play. They do, but the private sector and civil society and community groups have a role to play. And the problem is when there's a perception of overreach in this space, it puts off the very communities that we're trying to reach. I work with so many communities who are doing great things about countering extremism from an ideological point of view or from their community point of view, but the very policies that government puts forward in trying to attack this, because of the overreach, because of we see in schools, for example, the statutory duty to report radicalization, we have kids being called up because they mention terrorism in a class, or they bring a clock to class, in this case in America. That scares people. It scares a lot of people who want to fight this with us. And so we have to find a way to do this responsibly and carefully and practically, and make sure that everyone has the right role to play. And that coordination aspect is missing here, I'm afraid.
Well, it hasn't been found yet, Ed Husain, then, has it? I mean, do you go along with that? And it's, in a way, it's sullied. The message is not entirely believed if the hand of government is clearly behind it. It has to come from community groups and others.
It has to come from community groups, but government can't be devoid from this. Government's primary responsibilities, and we're all agreed on this, is to provide security.
But government, at the same time, if you step too far and they believe you can't be brought back, then the full force of the law is brought to bear upon you.
Again, this is one of those areas that's just so controversial. You're right that the government should not, and Zahed is right, have overreach, but let's be open and honest. One of the most effective programs in stopping people going to Syria and to Iraq has been the government's channel program. And that's where communities identify an individual, and the individual is then handed over to government supervision of sorts and then prevented from travelling through different forms of de-radicalisation led by the community. It is an initiative that the government and communities and civil society and the private sector, all of us must work on this together. Without government leadership, because it's only government to some extent that knows about the intelligence that feeds the strategy to stop people from going into combat zones.
We're nearly out of time. I just want to take from that, it's interesting what you say about the channel programme. I mean, would you say progress has been made?
With the channel programme and parts of the programme, absolutely yes. Without that, we would be in a far worse situation today. But we have miles more to go yet.
OK, well, let me put that to Zahed. Amanullah, do you feel that real progress in de-radicalisation, anti-radicalisation, before it gets to that point, has taken place?
Well, some progress has taken place, but I think we have to do more, and I think we have to find new ways of approaching this issue. We did a study, actually, where we looked for radicalization, signs of extremism for individuals on Facebook, and we had our former extremist network reach out to them and engage with them, and we had some very positive feedback from that. In fact, we found people who weren't on the channel program through that would be of interest. So there's other ways to do this, other ways of working with the private sector, with social media companies. I mean, the social media companies are getting a lot of pressure to take down content. We know they can't take down all the content that's out there, but they want to do something proactive. And I think until now, we haven't really sat down at the table with other partners and thought a very comprehensive strategy out and really looked at all the options. We really haven't done that yet. So we need to be more comprehensive in how we approach this issue.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for shedding some light on that. Zahed Amanullah and Ed Husain. Very good to see you both. And you're watching Myrna on Sky News. Coming up next.